Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV. I'm fishing today on the River Trent at Rolleston, which is just downstream of Newark, and this is Nottingham Piscatorials waters. I actually drew this peg on Saturday on a Riverfest qualifier and had a wonderful day's fishing, catching just under 20 pound of roach, and I caught them on tares, so I really wanted to come back and give it another go. It's just such a prolific stretch and very varied with different pegs and different species, and my zone was actually one off peg 1, which is obviously the end peg downstream, and he caught over 50 pound of beautiful big bream. So I knew on the day when I drew, the locals told me that I hadn't got much chance of qualifying because it's not a bream area, or not a noted bream area, certainly not to compete with that peg. So I just took the decision to try and catch what I could. On the day I actually balled some ground bait in and fed hemp and casters and a few tares over the top, and I started quite slowly, but after about an hour and a half I started to catch roach on the tares, and I stuck with it for the rest of the match. So today I thought I'd try a bit of a different angle as I'm pleasure fishing and just fish with the minimal amount of bait. Minimal in terms of cost, not necessarily volume. I've got 3 pints of hemp, a pint of tares and a pint of casters, and I've actually started off by just loose feeding hemp and casters, caught a few small dace early on and the odd roach on caster, and I've started catching on the tares already, so it's actually exceeded my expectations really. I was thinking I'd probably have to wait at least an hour to catch on the tare. The peg itself is really interesting because you can see we're on the inside of a big sweeping bend, and what's that's created is a defined channel quite close in really. It shelves off really deep. I've got around about 15-16 foot at just 13 meters, and even though it's not towing really hard, the river's quite low, it's deceptively powerful. And this is what I found at the weekend. It's quite an interesting peg to crack, but one that was really satisfying to get right on the day. Well, the Trent down here is a big river, and it could be quite daunting, particularly if you don't fish rivers much. But one thing's for sure, this river is now absolutely packed with silverfish, roach, dace, perch and small chub, as well as obviously all the big fish that a lot of anglers tend to focus on. So it's not a venue or a style of fishing that's very difficult at all, because it is so prolific. And I think it's fair to say that you can catch fish off pretty much any peg. There's obviously better areas, and there'll be better areas in different conditions. But I'd say this is a fairly typical peg, and I think hopefully if we have a good day's fishing, that'll be achievable from lots of swims along this section of the Trent. That's another nice roach. That's the kind of stamp that I was catching at the weekend. A really chunky fish, so you don't need a lot of fish to build a good weight. I'd say that one's probably around about 5 or 6 ounces. A massive advantage of fishing hemp and tares this time of year when you know there's a lot of fish in your peg, a lot of silverfish, is the fact that you can single out the roach. If I was just fishing maggots or casters on their own, you'd find that you'd get really pestered by other fish like bleak and smaller dace and smaller roach. You'd need a lot of bait, you know, probably a gallon of maggots, and I don't actually think you'd catch as much. So fishing with hemp and tares like this is a really efficient way of putting together a nice bag of roach, and certainly very, very enjoyable way. On some days you don't catch on the tare, you might just catch on hemp, and when it goes harder you can fish maggot or caster over the top and continue picking fish up. So it's a good idea to mix some casters and feed some maggots as well as the hemp and tares, and just vary the hook bait depending on the day and how the fish are responding. It's quite interesting today that the wind's quite a strong upstream breeze. A lot of the time on the Trent you've got a downstream wind which makes presentation more difficult with a float, and that's why, if I can, I like to fish a pole. If the fish are within pole range, I want to fish a pole because I can really get behind the float and improve my presentation over fishing with a running like a stick float, a waggler or a bollo. Obviously if the peg was shallower and the fish were further out, you'd have to fish a running line. That's a beautiful roach. Because this peg is so deep, that's another advantage of fishing the pole as well. I've had an interesting think about the rigs I've been using today. Normally when I'm hemp fishing, I suppose because growing up on the Warwickshire Avon and fishing slower, shallower venues than this, I tend to use much lighter floats. Light finesse floats right down to 0.1 of a gram. But I found out on Saturday that this peg, you really need to use a bigger float. And on the day I used a 1.5 gram float with an olivet, and then I had some spread shot out below it. But I felt it wasn't quite perfect because I was missing bites, and I think what was happening was the roach were feeling the weight of the olivet and rejecting it. So I've been thinking about it over the last few days, and I've actually made up a few different rigs. The one I'm using at the moment's 1.25 gram, and I've shotted it with stiles. I've made a bulk of stiles about 5 foot from the hook, and then I've got stiles spread out below, and it is working better. I seem to be connecting with more fish, missing less bites. But it is worth mentioning that I'm still fishing with a 1.25 float. Nice pheasant. And because I am on the inside of this bend and it's quite powerful, I've sort of worked out the best way of presenting the bait, and it's perhaps worth mentioning that I'm feeding slightly downstream, and I'm only actually feeding around about 11 meters out. A lot of the time on the river when I'm float fishing, I never feed upstream. By feeding slightly downstream, it's helping me to present my hook bait right in the feed, and that's essential, especially when you're fishing with hemp and tares, because fish can come up in the water, and I want to get the float and settle my float in the most optimum position in my swim to catch the fish as quickly as possible and present the bait as well as possible. And what I'm doing is I'm starting off around about 11 meters out, keeping some pole behind me, and as the float travels and trots down the swim, I can just push my pole further out downstream. I'm not having to go too far down the peg, but the fish, certainly on Saturday and for the most part today already, are kind of congregating in one good kind of killing zone in my swim. I think I'm going to have to change that tare because I missed a couple of bites. It's probably been chewed. But that's great when you're fishing like this and you've got the fish feeding confidently in one spot. It means that you can really maximise the best out of the swim and catch the fish as efficiently as possible. I'll try and show you what I mean. So I'm only swinging my float in around about 11 metres out, and I've got my 13 metre section behind me. I'm feeding a good pinch of hemp tares and casters around my float, and then I'm just lifting my float up to let the bulk settle and then gradually let the float down. And my thinking now is those styles below the bulk of styles are going to present the tare perfectly at the depth that the roach are feeding at. And typically the bites are quite positive. Because it's an upstream wind, I'm having to actually kind of guide my float down by keeping the pole tip almost in front of the float. Just absolutely perfect conditions for float fishing. I wouldn't be doing that if it was a downstream wind. I'd have to be keeping my pole tip well behind the float and perhaps backshot the float to enable the line to stay behind it. Well, I didn't get a bite that time. Anyway, I'll try again. Probably because I haven't got a tare on. It's always worth checking that. I just hold my rig up against the sky and I can see if I've got a tare or hemp hook bait still on. It's also worth mentioning that I'm fishing 6 metres of pole to hand, so I've got a decent amount of line to help me trot the float down through this swim. And that's an important thing as well. When you're river fishing, you need to use a longer length of line than you would do, certainly on the still water, to enable you to search the peg effectively and float fish properly. Oh, I bumped one. Like always when you're float fishing, if you start missing bites or have a period where you haven't caught a fish, you want to adjust your rig. Now in this case I'm going to shallow up just 6 inches, because often little adjustments like that will suddenly start you catching fish again. What's obviously happening is there's a great shoal of fish out there and they're moving up and down in the water, moving around the swim, intercepting the bait, and the depth that you're catching and the presentation that you're catching on can change quite dramatically through the day. Now let's see if that does the trick. Well, I had a bite. Still got my tare on. There we go, we got one. So in that case the wind's really got up and I was having to really pull my pole downstream of the float to ensure that I can get it to go through properly. That's a nice roach. That one's got to be 6 ounces. Absolutely pristine fish, aren't they, as well? I think these fish really thrive on neglect, because so many anglers that do fish the Trent are fishing for specimen fish like barbel and bream and even carp. The roach nowadays are really neglected, and I know, talking to some of the locals, that they've been catching roach well over £1 this season, so it's just great to see, and I'm absolutely loving it. Well, I've been fishing for about an hour and a half now, and I've been catching some nice roach, up to about 8 ounces. The wind's actually swung round, so it's actually blowing over the top now. And I've been basically just experimenting, trying different rigs. I've set 3 different rigs up. The 1.5 one, 1.25 and a 0.6. So I wanted to see if I could catch some bigger fish up in the water. Often when you're hemp fishing and hemp and tare fishing, you can catch the biggest roach well off the bottom. But today I was just catching a smaller stamp of roach. So I'm actually back on the 1.5 rig now, and I'm fishing pretty much at full depth. Within about a foot of the bottom seems to be the best area to catch them, and that was the same on Saturday as well. And a good advantage of using tares, especially on more powerful, deeper pegs like this, is perhaps the fact that they're a bit heavier. They tend to present themselves or fish a lot easier than perhaps fishing with a lighter grain of hemp. And that perhaps lends itself to catching the fish nearer the bottom as well today, because the tares are obviously a bit heavier and they'll hit the bottom perhaps before the hemp would. But It's really fantastic fishing, and that's the spot there, just sort of towards the end of my run is where I'm catching the fish, and I'm quite happy just to keep them there and keep picking them off. I was just about to mention a pike because when you're fishing on natural rivers like this, certainly on the Trent, there's a lot of pike, certainly where the roach are, and I don't like to mess about bringing them in. You want to get the fish in as quickly as possible, and that fish then, I don't know if chap who picked it up was being chased by a pike, one swirled behind it, so that's a shame because I hadn't had any pike trouble up until then. But fortunately, when you're fishing on the Trent and it's fishing as well as this, you can fish a bit heavier, a bit bigger hooks, slightly heavier elastic and slightly thicker line than I certainly would on the Warwickshire Raven. So that just helps you to perhaps get the fish out the swim quicker than if I was fishing fine. I'd have to take my time. Just going to pull the bulk up another 6 inches and spread the shot out a bit differently. The way I'm feeding it is I'm intentionally not feeding it in a really tight area. I'm using a bigger pouch on my catapult, and I'm feeding between 11 and probably 14 metres. I like to do that when you know you've got a lot of fish out there, because I don't want to try and concentrate them in too much of a small area, and if I can, I want to try and keep picking the fish off from the edge of the shoal. So I don't want to go too far into where the fish are feeding. I'm just trying to pick them off the edge and hopefully disturb them, or have the minimal disturbance when I'm hooking and playing the fish. Sometimes when it goes hard, just by adding a section on and going a bit further out, you'll be rewarded with some more fish, but I don't like to do that for too long, because then I just think if you keep doing that, you'll push the fish even further out. Whether that pike's just slowed things up a little bit, but I'm going to keep feeding. There's a fish. It obviously goes without saying, but I'm feeding at least every cast. The main aim today was to fish with hemp and tares, and you can see this is my feed mix that's comprising of hemp, tares and some casters. And I mentioned at the start, I do like to mix a few casters in as well, just as a change bait, and also I think it's got to attract some other smaller fish into the swim, so maybe those will then in turn attract the roach. What I tend to do is keep my hemp and tares separate and then add it to this mix as the day goes on. And one thing you'll notice is that I keep the hemp and tares and casters very wet, and that's actually the water and the juices that was produced when I boiled up the hemp. So I like to keep my hemp in those juices in a tub and not strain it off, because I actually believe that those juices and oils from the hemp can be a great attractor. And I've also got my tares mixed in there, and one thing I do with tares is I tend to cook them up in batches. So I'll cook up a good amount, maybe 4 or 5 pints, and then bag them up in small bags like this, small portions that I then freeze. And I like to do that because, for one, I think freezing them actually helps to slightly soften them. And two, I'm always using fresh tares through the day. So I haven't left them out on the side tray and they've maybe dried out with the sun. So when I open a new pack, I know that they're nice and fresh. Incidentally, talking about the tares, when I cook them, I don't add anything to them. I don't add any bicarbonate of soda to make them black. Don't add any sugar. I just like to have them natural, just boil them up in water, and I don't worry too much about them being absolutely perfect. As long as they don't sort of split in half when I squash them, as long as they squash like that, I'm happy. And as I say, because I tend to freeze them, I might freeze them 2 or 3 times and they do get slightly softer. But I don't want them too soft, particularly on a day like this when there's lots of fish feeding, because with a harder tare, if I miss a bite, it'll stay on. So that's an important consideration. And it goes for the same with the hemp really. I don't add anything to the hemp when I boil it. I just bring it to the boil, make sure that all the hemp's nice and split, and then let it just cool off naturally and keep everything in the juices. So one big advantage of how we're fishing today is actually the cost saving. When you think about it, if I've used 3 pints of hemp, a pint of tares and a pint of casters, I've probably only spent about £6 maximum on my bait, especially when you buy hemp and tares in bulk. And I get mine from Evolve Baits in Lincoln, and I actually did price it up, but I reckon a pint of hemp cooked cost me about 67p, and the tares cost about 95p a pint. So it really is a very cost efficient way of fishing. And as I mentioned as well, I think if I did just fish maggots and casters today, I'd get absolutely pestered by small fish. So the hemp and tares is definitely sorting out a better quality of fish. Well, I think it's good to show how I'm hooking the tares today. At the moment that's the Colmic size 18 hook, and I don't tend to keep my tares separate in terms of a hooking tare. I just like to pick them straight out of my mix, and I do try to go for the smaller tares. I think that's important, but certainly if you're catching a smaller stamp fish. But there's nothing simpler really. I'm just hooking the tare from one side to the other, and I'm kind of half hiding my hook, but I'm ensuring that the point's showing. So you can see that that 18 hook there doesn't look too big with that tare. That's presenting that tare really nicely. I don't want to try and hide the hook in the tare, because you'll find that you'll bump a lot of fish. I think sometimes the tares are quite hard, and if you try to bury the hook, you'll just simply be striking the tare into the fish's mouth and not hooking up. So if it's fishing really well and I'm confident I can show a lot of hook, I sometimes just nick the tare like this, a little bit like a maggot. So I've just nicked it through the skin like that, and that's another great way of ensuring that I've got wonderful hook hold and penetration, so avoid bumping fish. I'm feeding every cast at least once, and I'll just show you the sort of quantity that I'm feeding, if I can, whilst I'm holding my pole. So it's a good amount there, and that's why you need at least 3 or 4 pints of hemp and tares when you're fishing a big river like the Trent. So as the session progresses, then you can start to change the quantity that you're feeding. I think a good bit of advice is, if you're starting to miss bites and perhaps you feel the fish are off the bottom, you can start to feed less often but in bigger quantities to sort of try and get the fish down to the bottom. On other days when you want to be catching shallow and you're catching nice big roach up in the water, then I'll feed less and obviously increase the frequency to encourage those fish to come up off the bottom. Well, that pike finally managed to grab one of my fish. I caught it down the bottom of my peg, and I perhaps took a bit too long bringing him in, and he's nailed it. Hopefully he'll let go, because I don't think it's a big one. It's actually a big perch. There you go. Just shows you just never know. Now I'm sure that took a fish. I can't believe he would have taken a grain of a tare, but well, that just shows you in a match you don't always want to pull for a break, because You never know what it is. Let's have a look. I can see the fish in his mouth as well, so he did take a roach. I'll hold him up for you. Look at him. Big old Billy perch. I mean, that's got to be £1.5 pounds, maybe even knocking £2. He's a bit angry, so I don't quite know if we're going to get this roach out because he's taken it half the way down. I don't know if Chappie can see that, but I can just see the tail of the roach down his mouth, his big massive. Right, I think the only way to get out of this is to break the hook length, and he's got the roach, so there we go. Well, if that was a match, that definitely would have been a bonus. How about that, mate? So I briefly touched on the rigs. Let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. This is the heavier rig. This is a 1.5 gram desk float that's actually called a Thames. You can see the big benefit for me is this wonderful hollow tip. Light conditions on the Trent can be really difficult. You get this ripple and the different colours of reflections on the water from the trees. And this, for me, yellow hollow bristle like that, a quite nice thickness, really shows up very well. So that's really imperative for me. It's got a carbon stem, which I like. Doesn't tend to wrap over too much, and this shape I think is absolutely great for nearly all my river fishing. It allows me to run the bait through and also hold it back and control it perfectly. On this rig I've got an Olivette, and I've got my Olivette around about, at the moment it's got to be getting on for 4 foot from the hook. So I've just got the Olivette stocked with 2 number 8s, and then these are actually number 8s spread out down between the Olivette and my hook length. I've got 4 number 10s, that's all. And I've just been moving those around to adjust the presentation. And it is curious that this rig works so well. I think I mentioned it, the fact that it's such a deep and actually powerful peg. I think the Olivette's helping me get down to the feeding zone and kind of boss the float, allow me to control it. And then I've still got that bit of finesse as the Hemp or Tare drops through the water. Mainline on all the rigs is this 0.125 Vest Pro, and hook length line is the same material but 0.87. I think I mentioned a lot of the time when I'm fishing on the Avon and harder venues, I'll fish with much finer gear than this when I'm Hemp and Tare fishing. But on the Trent, on a day like this, there's fish to be caught, and I want to make sure that I'm catching them as quickly as I can and as positively as possible. Hook wise, I've changed between a Drennan Carbon Match in an 18 and these Colmic hooks. It's a B957 in either a 20 or an 18 size. I think if I was concentrating on the Hemp, I'd be fishing a 20, but on the Tare, because obviously it's a bigger bait, you can get away with a slightly bigger hook. Alright, I'll just show you the other couple of rigs, because I am actually catching on all of the different rigs, and swapping between them is working really well. This is actually the same pattern of float, so that's a Census Desk Thames, but 1.25, and in this case I've shotted it with styles. These are number 13 styles. I don't know if you can see that, but I've got them in this sort of tight, slightly spread bulk. There's about 15 of them there, and then below that I've got these number 9 styles equally spread out. So a bit like the Olivette, that bait's going to get down quite quickly in the powerful water, and then I'm going to have a nice fall with the styles. And I do like using styles when I'm Hemp and Tare fishing. For one, you do get that wonderful presentation, the nice slow fall, but the other thing, I think it eliminates shot bites, which can cause some concern at times, and obviously if you eliminate that, you're not worrying about it. And this rig's great because it's versatile. I can spread those styles out. I might even move the bulk up to halfway, and I've got a multitude of different ways of presenting the bait with that rig. And then finally is my lighter rig, which I'm using for fishing up in the water, so well off the bottom. Still probably fishing about 6 or 7 foot deep in this 16 foot deep swim. It's a similar pattern. That's actually an old Super Team float. That's a gram. It's got the same kind of hollow tip, and it's a 0.6. So in this case I've just got my styles spread out in the bottom half of the rig, so obviously that's going to give me a much better presentation in the upper layers of the water. Interestingly, I will keep trying it, but definitely when I've caught fish on this today, it's been a smaller stamp of fish. So the bigger fish seem to be nearer the bottom, and the other two rigs are working well. Elastic wise, I'm using a number 6 Preston in the 2 bigger rigs, and a number 5 Preston on the lighter rig when I'm fishing up in the water. I like to do that because sometimes you hook some bigger roach shallow and you just want that extra forgiveness in the elastic just to stop bumping them off. Just can't beat fishing hemp and tares for roach like that. Absolutely brilliant sport. Well, we've been fishing for good 3 or 4 hours now, and I must have double figures of roach plus that nice perch, bonus perch. And it's interesting, I'm definitely getting fluctuations in the stamp of the fish. I've been trying up in the water with even trying hemp, and I'm just catching sort of 2-3 ounce roach. Definitely the better stamp fish are nearer the bottom and definitely on the Tare. One thing I've found is sort of you can induce a bite when you're fishing the Tare. So I'm not just running my float straight through at the speed of the current. I'm holding back the float, lifting the float, and generally working it, and it's just amazing how many times you do that and you get rewarded with a bite straight away. Whether it's just lifts the Tare slightly and it drops naturally, I don't know, but you definitely want to experiment with changing how you're trotting and presenting the float. Every cast I missed that bite and it nicked my Tare. I've tried caster as a change bait and I'm just getting, well, the float's not even settling, it's just getting intercepted by small fish on the drop. So today's definitely not a day for the caster, but on its day it's a great little trick. Just trying a caster, sometimes you get a bonus fish. Obviously you can sometimes catch a perch on a caster that you wouldn't really catch on hemp or tares, so I'll often do that, and also try a maggot as well. The pole I'm using is our CP2000 pole, and it's a wonderfully versatile pole. I use it pretty much for everything now, and I'm only using it at 13 meters today, but it's available up to 16 meters. And the way we sell our pole is we don't do it as a package. You can select your own package. So if you have a look on the website, you'll see all the pricing for the 13 meter pole, all the extensions, mini extensions, cupping kits, top kits. So you can design the package that perfectly fits the type of fishing and venues that you're going to. Like today I've only set up 3 rigs, but they're all on top 6s. So we do a price for a top 5, and we also do an individual price for all the sections, so you can price up a top 6. If you do a lot of river fishing using a top 6 is a big advantage. I think I mentioned about it. When you're fishing on flowing water like this, you need to have a longer length of line between the float and the tip to enable you to search your peg out effectively. I also think it helps because you're keeping the pole tip away from the float as well. So on shallower pegs and on really cold, clear, rather bright days, it's a good advantage to use a longer line for that reason as well. That's a nice stamp roach, and I think with that fish I'm going to call it a day. It's been absolutely brilliant fun. I haven't caught anything over 8 ounce today, but I've thoroughly enjoyed catching beautiful stamp fish like that on the Tare. Well, Chappie's called time and weighed me in, and I've had just over 20 pounds, so with the help of that big perch I've beaten the weight I had at the weekend. Let's get them back. Just shows what a great venue the Trent is. Also, using hemp and tares on rivers can be so effective. Thanks for watching.